Ma'am, can you provide ID and proof of residency right now?
On what legal basis am I being detained at a school pickup?
Step out of the vehicle. You're refusing a lawful order.
Is there reasonable suspicion or a warrant justifying this command?
Have you ever noticed how the most life-altering moments never announce themselves? They do not arrive with warning sirens or dramatic soundtracks. Instead, they sneak into the most ordinary, mundane routines of our lives, right when our guard is entirely down. Today's story is about exactly that. It is a masterclass in why you should never let unchecked bias guide your actions and why underestimating someone based on unfair assumptions can cost you absolutely everything. This is a story about the danger of relying on snap judgments instead of facts and the incredible power of knowing your legal rights. Before we dive into this unbelievable journey of justice, let me ask you, have you ever been judged instantly by someone who knew absolutely nothing about your background or your capabilities? Tell me about your experience in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button if you believe that accountability matters. Now let us get into it. Picture a typical suburban afternoon in late autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves mixed with the exhaust of dozens of idling vehicles. It was that chaotic window of time right after the final school bell rings, where a peaceful neighborhood suddenly transforms into a gridlocked maze of minivans and sedans. Sitting right in the middle of this daily pickup line was a mother named Valerie. She was off the clock, dressed in her most comfortable loungewear, a soft knit sweater and athletic leggings, with her young son's brightly colored backpack resting on the passenger seat. Her little boy, Leo, had just hopped into the car, his eyes wide as he animatedly explained a science experiment he had learned about that day. It was supposed to be a completely unremarkable Tuesday. But Valerie was not just a typical suburban mom, and her situational awareness was sharper than most. For over a decade, she had worn the uniform of a sworn law enforcement officer. Her training had hardwired her to scan environments constantly, reading body language and identifying anomalies long before the average civilian would even look up from their steering wheel. And right then, in her rearview mirror, she spotted a massive anomaly. A dark, unmarked utility vehicle had abruptly parked in a zone strictly designated for school buses. 3 men wearing plain clothes over heavy tactical vests stepped out. They did not look like concerned parents or school administrators. They moved with a synchronized, heavy-footed confidence that screamed federal authority. Valerie recognized the posture immediately. It was the stance of individuals operating under the assumption of absolute power, people who were accustomed to unquestioned compliance. What caught her attention most, however, was their trajectory. They were bypassing every other vehicle in the line and making a direct, unwavering path straight toward her driver's side door. If you were sitting in your car outside your child's school, minding your own business, how would you react to 3 armed strangers approaching your window? Would you panic? Would you immediately comply? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Valerie did not panic. Her mind instantly shifted into analytical mode. She mentally reviewed the fundamental principles of a lawful stop. For any law enforcement agent to detain an individual, they must possess a reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. Sitting in a school pickup line violated no statutes. Existing in a public space required no justification. Yet as the men closed the distance, she could clearly read the acronym of a federal task force printed in bold letters across their protective gear. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and she knew it was entirely rooted in a fundamental misjudgment of who she was. Leo's enthusiastic chatter faded away. The 8-year-old's bright smile melted into a mask of pure confusion as the shadow of the lead agent fell over his mother's window. Valerie offered her son a gentle, reassuring smile, silently promising him that she had everything under control, even as her pulse began a slow, steady climb. The lead official tapped sharply on the glass. He did not offer a greeting. He did not acknowledge that they were in a designated safe zone for children. His face was an unreadable mask of bureaucratic indifference. Valerie rolled her window down just a fraction, enough to communicate but not enough to compromise the physical barrier of her vehicle. She kept both hands firmly planted at the 10 and 2 positions on her steering wheel. She knew all too well that sudden movements around individuals who were already operating on high alert could lead to disastrous misunderstandings. The man's voice was completely devoid of emotion as he announced his agency and stated they were conducting a random compliance verification in the sector. He demanded to see her identification and immediate proof of her legal residency status. It was a demand issued without legal merit. It was a fishing expedition based entirely on an assumption drawn from her appearance, completely bypassing the constitutional protections that govern lawful encounters. Valerie's response was a masterclass in de-escalation and professional boundary setting. She maintained a perfectly level, authoritative tone, the exact same voice she utilized when managing chaotic crime scenes. She calmly informed the men that she was an off-duty officer with the local municipal police department. She clearly articulated that her civilian driver's license was located inside her purse, and her official department credentials were secured in the vehicle's glove box. She offered to retrieve them slowly or invited them to contact the local dispatcher to verify her identity immediately. The agent did not flinch. He did not process the information. Instead, he doubled down, his voice dripping with condescension as he stated that people make false claims every single day. He reiterated his demand for documentation, treating her offer of verification as an act of defiance. The situation was escalating, driven by an authority figure who was incapable of admitting he had made a flawed assumption. He ordered her to exit the vehicle. Let's pause for a second. The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. A lawful command to exit a vehicle typically requires a valid initial stop, usually a traffic violation or a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Neither existed here. The demand was an exercise in intimidation, pure and simple. Valerie looked at her son. Leo was trembling now, his small hands gripping his seatbelt. The fear radiating from him ignited a fierce, protective fire deep within her chest. But she knew that arguing law on the side of the road with armed men was a losing battle. The courtroom was where you fought. The street was where you survived. She opened her door with slow, deliberate movements. She stepped onto the pavement, keeping her hands visible and open. But before her feet were fully planted, the lead agent grabbed her wrist. The cold, unforgiving steel of a handcuff ratcheted tightly around her skin. He wrenched her arms behind her back with an aggressive force that was entirely disproportionate to her calm demeanor. From inside the car, Leo let out a sound that would haunt Valerie for the rest of her life. A high-pitched, desperate cry for his mother. The sound shattered the afternoon quiet. All around them, the daily routine ground to a halt. Minivan engines were turned off. Car doors swung open. Dozens of parents stepped out, pulling their smartphones from their pockets. Lenses focused, recording lights blinked on, capturing the entire unjust spectacle from multiple angles. People began shouting, demanding to know what the men were doing, screaming that there were children present, warning the agents that they were making a massive mistake. The federal agents ignored the crowd. They marched Valerie toward their unmarked transport van, treating a decorated local officer like a dangerous fugitive. They locked her in the back of the dark vehicle, leaving her terrified son sitting alone in her car. Sitting in the dim, claustrophobic space of the transport van, Valerie did not cry. She did not yell. Instead, her mind became a steel trap of legal strategy. She mentally cataloged every single protocol violation: unlawful detainment, lack of probable cause, excessive force on a compliant subject, civil rights violations. What the agents entirely failed to realize was that before Valerie ever put on a police uniform, she had spent a decade wearing tailored suits in federal courthouses. She had been a highly formidable civil rights attorney, specializing in dismantling unlawful government overreach. She had left her lucrative legal practice to join the police academy, because she genuinely believed that the best way to improve a system was to understand it from the inside out. She rarely spoke of her past life. In her current profession, broadcasting her legal background often invited unwanted friction, but the brilliant legal mind had never faded. It had only been waiting in the shadows. And these men had just dragged it back into the light. Outside the van, the situation was spiraling out of the agent's control. The parents had essentially formed a human barricade, their vehicles blocking the transport van from leaving the pickup lane. The local precinct had been flooded with emergency calls from furious citizens witnessing an abduction disguised as law enforcement. It took nearly an hour of tense radio chatter and frantic phone calls for the federal agents to run her information through the proper channels, the exact channels she had practically begged them to use in the first place. When the realization of what they had done finally hit them, the heavy van doors swung open. They removed the steel cuffs without a single word of apology. There was no explanation, no remorse, just a stiff command indicating she was free to go. Valerie stepped out into the fading daylight, rubbing her bruised wrists. She walked directly to her vehicle, wrapping her arms around her sobbing son, holding him as tight as she possibly could. She felt the heavy gaze of a dozen camera lenses capturing the raw, devastating aftermath of the ordeal. At that moment, the fear and humiliation she felt evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. The first few nights following the incident were agonizing. Leo suffered from severe night terrors, waking up screaming whenever a passing car's headlights swept across his bedroom ceiling. Valerie spent those sleepless hours sitting on the edge of his bed, using her phone to organize the massive influx of digital evidence. Parents from the school had banded together, sending her gigabyte upon gigabyte of high-definition footage. She watched the encounter repeatedly from every conceivable angle. She analyzed the complete lack of justification. It was a textbook example of systemic bias, a perfect storm of unwarranted assumptions and unchecked authority. Valerie immediately initiated the bureaucratic process, filing formal requests for all internal communications, dispatch logs, and body camera footage. She knew exactly which levers to pull to force the system to yield its secrets. A week later, she sat down in the sleek, modern office of a former colleague, an aggressive litigator named Sarah who specialized exclusively in government accountability. When Sarah reviewed the meticulously organized binders of evidence Valerie had compiled, she was stunned. The case was practically trying itself. They drafted a massive federal lawsuit, naming the government agency and the individual operatives. The core arguments were ironclad: unlawful seizure, gross violations of constitutional rights, and targeted harassment. But the true bombshell dropped weeks later during the mandatory exchange of evidence, a phase lawyers call discovery. Valerie had cast a wide net, demanding all internal emails regarding the operation at the school. What the agency legally had to turn over left both women absolutely speechless. Hidden deep within a digital mountain of routine patrol schedules were direct communications between the lead official at the scene and a high-ranking regional director named Marcus Thorne. The emails explicitly mentioned Valerie by name. They detailed her daily schedule, her vehicle make and model, and specifically highlighted her child's school as a prime location for a random compliance check. Valerie stared at the printed pages, a cold realization washing over her. She knew the name Marcus Thorne. Years ago, during her time as a civil rights lawyer, she had represented a group of innocent citizens who had been unlawfully swept up in a massive, poorly planned federal dragnet authorized by Thorne. She had dismantled his entire operation in federal court, exposing his complete disregard for civil liberties and costing his department millions in restitution. He had sat across from her in that courtroom, his face red with fury as the judge delivered a humiliating ruling against him. Thorne had never forgotten her, and the moment he realized she was working off duty in his jurisdiction, he had utilized federal resources to orchestrate a terrifying, humiliating revenge plot. This was not just a case of random bias or a misjudgment by street-level operatives. It was a premeditated, malicious conspiracy originating from the highest levels of regional leadership. How would you feel if you discovered that a powerful government official had used their entire department just to settle a personal grudge against you? Let me know your thoughts down below. The discovery completely altered the landscape of the impending legal battle. What started as a complaint about a bad stop transformed into a massive expose of systemic corruption and abuse of power. Valerie became the shadow architect of her own legal strategy. She spent her off hours poring through obscure legal precedents, finding historic rulings that proved a pattern of retaliatory behavior within the agency. The government realized they were walking into a buzzsaw. 3 weeks before the scheduled trial, they dispatched their top fixers to offer a settlement. They slid a piece of paper across a polished conference table. A massive 6-figure payout, contingent upon Valerie signing an airtight, permanent, non-disclosure agreement. They wanted to bury the truth under a mountain of cash. For many, that money would be life-changing, but Valerie did not even blink. She pushed the paper back across the table. She looked the government attorneys dead in the eye and explained that darkness is where corruption thrives, and she was going to drag their entire operation into the blinding light of a public courtroom. The media caught wind of the story, and it exploded. National news networks ran the smartphone footage on a continuous loop. Civil liberties organizations rallied behind her. The community where she patrolled held massive support drives. The trial date loomed like a hurricane forming off the coast. When the trial finally commenced, the atmosphere in the federal courthouse was electric. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Valerie sat perfectly upright at the plaintiff's table, dressed impeccably in her formal police uniform, every brass button polished to a mirror shine. It was a visual reminder to the jury that she was a protector of the law, currently fighting those who had abused it. The trial was a masterclass in legal dismantling. Sarah, her attorney, played the synchronized video footage on massive screens. The jury watched in absolute silence as a compliant mother was forcefully restrained while her child screamed in terror. The defense attempted to argue that the men were simply following standard regional directives. Then it was Valerie's turn to take the stand. The defense lawyers, assuming she was merely a tough police officer out of her depth in a federal courtroom, tried to rattle her. They asked condescending questions, implying she should have been more cooperative, suggesting her reaction was overly dramatic. They had no idea who they were tangling with. Valerie answered their questions by citing specific, historic Supreme Court rulings from memory. She calmly explained the precise legal definitions of reasonable suspicion and unlawful detainment. She dismantled their arguments with the surgical precision of a seasoned litigator, transforming her cross-examination into a devastating lecture on constitutional law. The defense attorney, visibly sweating, ended his questioning abruptly and retreated to his table. But the final blow came when they presented the emails. The jury saw the direct evidence of the vendetta. They saw Marcus Thorne's written instructions to target a woman who had simply held him accountable years prior. The narrative shifted instantly. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about the weaponization of government authority for personal revenge. The government desperately offered a second settlement, this time in the millions, begging to halt the proceedings. Valerie refused again. This was never about a paycheck. It was about creating an undeniable permanent legal precedent. It was about ensuring that the next time a vindictive official tried to abuse their power, there would be a massive legal roadblock standing in their way. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. When they finally returned, the tension in the room was suffocating. The foreperson stood up and read the verdict. They found the operatives and the agency entirely liable on every single count: unlawful seizure, civil rights violations, targeted harassment, and they confirmed the existence of a malicious conspiracy. The jury did not just award damages. They delivered a punitive hammer blow to the agency. handing down a multi-million-dollar judgment that shattered records and sent shockwaves through every federal enforcement office in the country. The courtroom erupted. Cheers echoed off the marble walls. The flashing lights of cameras waited in the hallway. Valerie simply closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. She had protected her child. She had vindicated her name. And she had struck a massive blow against men's systemic arrogance. In the months that followed, Valerie made a monumental decision. She formally retired from the police force, trading her badge for a briefcase once again. Using the massive settlement, she founded a massive, non-profit legal clinic dedicated entirely to representing citizens who had been unlawfully targeted by government overreach or systemic prejudice. She spent her days mentoring brilliant young lawyers, teaching them exactly how to dismantle broken systems from the ground up. Leo grew up watching his mother change the world. The fear from that October afternoon eventually faded, replaced by a deep, unwavering respect for the law and the courage required to uphold it. Valerie's story is a powerful reminder that you should never, ever assume you know the entirety of a person's story based on a passing glance. Bias and unfounded assumptions are the tools of the ignorant, and they will eventually shatter when they strike the solid rock of truth and preparation. She proved that when you underestimate someone, you give them the ultimate advantage. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in standing up to unchecked power and fighting for accountability, hit that like button right now. Make sure you are subscribed and have those notifications turned on so you never miss a story of incredible resilience. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that justice is always worth fighting for. And before you go, jump into the comments and let me know, what was the biggest takeaway you got from Valerie's journey? Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, stay educated on your rights, and I will see you in the next video.